The
Thanks, Mitch.
broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Welcome to the next in our series of support webinar sessions that we've had. Today we're going to talk about automating your vendor onboarding. Also want to mention that we're assembling some additional topics for future webinars. A couple of them that we've got on our plate that we're considering. We've talked about, well, we will be talking about vendor onboarding. We've already talked about personnel onboarding. Another one is client onboarding. And so we talked about having a webinar on that. Another one with a lot of our manufacturers is the EDI 810 processing, receiving invoicing through EDI 810s. So talking about having one on that. Another one is outsourcing of your vendor invoice processing. So that's another one. If you have some other thoughts or ideas on topics that you would like to see us do, I would invite you to put those into the chat session, and we will then add those to our list in our rotation. My name's Jack Arnston. I am a principal at the Priton Group, and joining me this morning is my business partner, Bill Priton, along with J.D. Arnston, who is a senior systems engineer with the Priton Group. Our agenda for this morning, we're going to start by talking a little bit about why the need to automate vendor onboarding. Why is it important? From there, we will talk about how we actually build the solution, and then we'll get into how it actually works, what it looks like, what those benefits are, and we're going to finish things up with a question and answer session at the end. So if you've been on other webinars that we've had, you'll be familiar with this, but we're going to ask you to participate, and you can do that one of two different ways. The first would be to ask a question via the chat. And if you go to the GoToWebinar dialog box, you will see there's a section there where you can enter a question, submit, and we'll be monitoring those for you. The second is you can ask a question, and the way that you would do that, in that same dialog area, you'll see a hand with a red arrow key pointing down. If you actually click on that, it will change to a green arrow key, and it will notify me that you have a question that you would like to ask. And when we get to that point of the webinar, I will announce you, I will unmute you, and allow you to ask your question. So don't be shy. Feel free to raise your hand, and we'll have you ask questions on that. So just to kind of recap, we really would like to have your participation and ask you to ask your questions either the chat or by raising your hand. And I just want to remind you as well that we will be recording the session, and I will send a link to you either later today or early tomorrow so that you can, if you want, either rewatch it or share it with someone else. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill, and he's going to get us started. Bill?
Thanks, Jack. So what's a big idea? So why vendor onboarding? Jack had mentioned that we really feel very firmly that vendor onboarding is an important thing to do and consider automating with the use of FileBound within your organization. Every organization has to onboard their vendors, and to the greatest extent possible, we want to try to help automate that process to make it easier for both you and for the vendors. Onboarding basically is a process whereby we're going to be collecting up all the necessary data, and we do that through documents, either through physical documents or through, preferably, e-forms, electronic forms, to collect that information. The kinds of information we're typically collecting are vendor contract, their contact information, remittance information, tax information, through a variety of different forms and sources. The idea is, rather than doing anything manually, try to automate it. Let's try to create an environment that'll make things more efficient through the leveraging of the automation within FileBound. So the big benefit is you start to see that your onboarding process accelerates. It gets quicker, more efficient, and faster to do. Makes it easier for the people in your organization to get the vendors onboarded and start working with them, because that's the reason why they want to onboard them, is because they want to work with them. They want to get their goods and their services. It saves that valuable time so that your value workers don't have to do the types of mundane tasks associated sometimes with having to get documents sent back and forth and the handling of the manual processes. Or even if you feel like you're automated by sending emails, it's still a manual process to do so. So you're saving the valuable time. You can eliminate delayed payments that you're sending out due to a lack of the documentation. Thereby improving your vendor relations. You also have a single secure destination for all of your documents to come in, so they're accessible while you're onboarding and after the fact from anywhere by anyone who is secured to see those documents. You can also include other documents in your vendor project. So the vendor project is used to help initiate and onboard, but then after they've been created as a vendor, they're going to have their vendor file. So we encourage extending the use of the vendor project to hold other types of documents. Our example we give here are contracts, and we can get into contract management processes as well. So real great benefits there. So basically what it amounts to is by the time we get through with any of these automation processes, your paper and your manual processes are gone. So today, we're going to walk through two very specific types of scenarios. One is the intentional vendor selection and onboarding process. So this is what you typically think of when you say, hey, I'm going to have an vendor onboarding project. For today's examples, we're going to talk about three primary forms. We realize that there's probably more forms available, and depending on the industry that you're in or the type of business that you do, you may have more and varied documents. But for today's example, these three kind of help to round out the concepts and the picture quite nicely. We're going to start with our vendor request form. Then from there, we get the vendor information form filled out, completed, and then the W-9. Then after we kind of cover that deliberate process that we want to have in place for the day-to-day onboarding of vendors, we'll touch a little bit about how do we handle unexpected vendor maintenance and unexpected situations where the vendors need to comply and send in forms. Today's example is going to talk about the AP approval process and how within that process we can actually capture the scenario where a vendor is a vendor but they don't have their W-9 on file. And how do we sort of enforce that level of compliance to get that W-9 in place? And that can be the W-9. It can be any form that's either missing and is required, or maybe we may have the document, but it might have expired its time constraints. It might have required a renewal of a form. So we can catch all of those types of things. And then finally, at the end here, we'll talk a little bit about making the forms available and what kinds of forms we can put in, like W-9 update forms or contact and account change forms and banking information so that you can have the information available for doing your ACHs. So we're going to cover all of that today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to JD, who's going to take you through the first of those two specific scenarios, and that is the deliberate ingestion or onboarding of a new vendor through the vendor process. So JD, you can take it away.
Thanks, Bill. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just kind of walk through the process in a nutshell. So hold on a sec, just getting there we go. All right, so this process initially gets kicked off by somebody, one of your own internal employees, filling out a new vendor request form on the FileBound Forms portal and submitting that into FileBound. From there, that'll kick off a workflow, and after getting initial approval, someone on the AP team can then send out a welcome email from the workflow that will include the new vendor information form, as well as any other required forms that need to be sent to that vendor as well. So that'll kick off sort of a collection of documents and building the file phase, where we will update index fields and populate documents in the new vendor file. After all the required documentation is collected, we can then validate through the workflow that everything looks good. And from there, the process will be released to purchasing and sales team for any additional follow-up that needs to be done. And kind of from there on out, that step is optional, and it can also vary greatly depending on the solution and your needs, as well as for what your vendor onboarding process looks like. So we'll start by taking a look at the forms portal. So an employee will initiate this process by going to your FileBound Forms portal. There they will select the new vendor request form and simply click open to get to it. So here's an example of what the new vendor request form looks like. Again, all of this can vary, but this is what we have set up for this demo. And so we can do custom scripting in these forms to auto-populate values. You can see here, for instance, we populate the new vendor ID temporarily with a system date and time, just so that it ensures that for this part of the process, that vendor has a unique ID, and we can change that accordingly to however you need to make your vendor IDs as well. So from there, the submitter will simply fill out the rest of the form with that new vendor's information, attach any necessary documents, and submit it. So once they submit that, that will kick off the vendor onboarding workflow. Here you can see one assignment. It's assigned to Bill for the vendor onboarding process. And in the data view, we can see that this vendor's status is still set to not verified, and that its workflow status is set to assigned for initial review. That just helps to kind of keep track of where these are at in this entire process. So if we open this up, if we open up this workflow assignment in the viewer, you can see in the left-hand side in the tree view that we currently have the new vendor request form, and we can view its index information, including things like vendor status from here as well. On the right-hand side are our workflow options, and we can choose to send an onboarding email to the vendor, mark this vendor request as approved if we have all of its required documents, or deny the vendor request outright. In this case, we'll simply choose to send an onboarding email to the vendor. So here's an example of what that onboarding email might look like from the vendor's perspective. We include a link to the new vendor information request form here, as well as a link to the W-9 form. And we can customize how this is all laid out as well. But for now, we'll take a look at what it looks like when the vendor clicks on the link for the new vendor information request form. So once the vendor has clicked on that link, they will then be able to begin filling out the form, such as their vendor information, their address, and any other pertinent information. And once that form is filled out, they simply click submit, and that will send the document into their vendor file in FileBound. Once the information form is received, the workflow status and any other relevant index fields will be updated. So here you can see that the status has been updated to reflect that the information form has been received and that we're still awaiting additional documents. So again, from the vendor side, in their email, we'll then go and click on the link for the W-9. And that will again take them out to the forms portal. Although a little bit differently this time, we can populate some of the forms fields using data from the previously submitted forms. So in this case, we're populating the vendor's name and their address information. So from there, the vendor will simply fill out any remaining fields that need to be completed on this W-9 and click submit, which will also send this into their vendor file in FileBound. So at this point, we can see that we have all of our required documents in the viewer and FileBound, including the W-9 that we just submitted. Once we have all of these documents, we will simply choose the vendor approved option for the workflow options on the right-hand side. And one thing to note as well is that when you do this, we can also do additional checks in the workflow that will evaluate the documents you've got out there, and they can also double check, I should say, to make sure that you have all of those required documents. If they're all there, great, it'll keep moving it on. If they're not, it can kick it back and alert that we're missing some of those required documents. But in this case, we have everything we need. And so now you can see that the vendor status is set to active. And now it's assigned to the purchaser for any additional actions that are needed in this process. Once the purchaser is done, they will simply select completed on the right-hand side, which will remove this vendor from the onboarding workflow and finish up that process. So that kind of wraps up and sums up this part of the vendor onboarding process. I'm going to hand it back over to Bill, and he's going to walk through a second scenario of making sure that we have required vendor forms when that vendor already exists.
Thanks, JD. So as JD just mentioned, the part that he just showed you was that deliberate, systematic process for bringing vendors on board and making sure that we have everything that we need, and we've been able to communicate that out to the rest of the organization. Now, further on, we want to try to catch scenarios elsewhere. So in this case, we're going to give you an example of how we can validate and then catch scenario where we're missing a document or documents, or those documents have expired, for example. During another process, somewhat unrelated to vendor onboarding, but still related to the entire vendor relationship, and that's accounts payable. So in this case, we're going to be evaluating the invoices during the workflow process as they come in. And we're going to check for things like, are they an active vendor? What is their status? Is it set to active? Are they suspended? Are they not a vendor yet? Are they right in the middle of the process? The example I gave earlier was that might be in the middle of the onboarding process and an invoice was sent inadvertently. And so their status may not reflect that they are a vendor yet, but yet they released an invoice. And so we can check and evaluate that and then adjust the workflow accordingly, which you'll see in a bit. What this means is that we're able to really expand and leverage the accounts payable workflow to reach into other areas of the organization to make sure that we have what we need to do good business. Now, one of the advantages of this is it creates kind of a high sense of urgency. So if you've got a vendor that is missing a document that you really do need, that W-9 is the example we're going to share today. It could be any number of documents that you might need in order to meet compliance and audit requirements. So by creating a sense of urgency, by being able to take that invoice and setting it off on the side, suspending it from being processed, and then communicating to the vendor that they need to return this form. Once that's done, we can validate and complete that process from within the accounts payable workflow. So although we've showed you thus far a workflow within the vendor project, we're actually now using this workflow within the accounts payable project to reach into the vendor file, make sure that everything is updated. And if not, then handle it directly within the accounts payable workflow. But once that's done, then we can release the invoice for payment, and it flows its way through the balance of the accounts payable approval. Now, the advantage, as I mentioned earlier, is that it keeps you in compliance and make sure that all your files are complete or as complete as they need to be for this particular interaction with accounts payable. But the additional thing is that it helps to protect you during your audits. And so you're sort of killing a whole bunch of birds with one stone here by being able to automate this process from within accounts payable. So if we look at what the workflow might look like for this, this is the stop in the workflow where we actually evaluate whether the W-9 is on file. So we have a stencil that simply looks and checks to see if in the vendor file the W-9 is on file. And if it's not, for this example, then we slide it over to a stencil that holds and suspends that invoice from being paid. We then send an email to the vendor indicating that they are missing a document. We need them to fill it out. So an example of this is here we have a couple of documents that have been exceptioned and suspended. And this one happens to be that this invoice was suspended awaiting a W-9 from a company called Leads. So the email that's sent to the vendor looks like this. They receive an email saying, hey, we know that you're a vendor, but you're missing your W-9. We need to have that on file before we can pay your invoice or process it any further. So as you can see, we set a link. And when they click on that link, it's going to take them directly to the W-9 file. And similar to how JD had shown you earlier, we were able to take leveraged information that we know has been vetted and is accurate, and we can fill that into the form. So in this case, we have their name, their address, and the EIN. So we're able to pre-populate that for them. The only thing they really have to do now is to identify what their corporate structure is for us or validate it via the W-9, and then sign it, and then hit the submit button. Now they have done their part and they've submitted that back into FileBound, and it's gone into their vendor file. So within our accounts payable workflow, though, we have the use of escalations that we've set up so that what it does is the escalation reaches out on a scheduled basis and looks for the presence of that W-9 in the vendor file. So it reaches into the vendor file and finds it. And we set this up on a scheduled basis. So it can happen once a day, it can happen once every hour, it can happen once a week, depending on the document and the need to make sure that we're as timely as we can be will determine what our schedule or frequency needs to be. In this case, we're going to escalate once a day. We're going to see if the W-9 has been returned. And if it has, we evaluate. And if it has, then the yes pushes it on through the balance of the workflow and gets processed and paid like normal. If the answer is no, it hasn't returned yet, maybe the vendor is taking a day or two to gather the information or make the decision or whatever they need to do. So it hasn't come in 24 hours. It might take a couple of days. So the no will simply slide it back over to our waiting for W-9 form or stencil, and escalates through a day later and continues to check. From here, if we wanted to, if, for example, we didn't want this to continue indefinitely, and we could actually set a limit of certain number of days, for example, with this W-9, that maybe after 5 days, we then say, okay, we just can't keep sending this back. We're going to need to send this to somebody to investigate why is this taking so long. Or we can just simply send another nudge reminder to the vendor saying, hey, we sent you this W-9 5 days ago. We'd really like to get it back. So we can also manage that escalation, not only to check to see if the document has been returned, but also, again, as I said earlier, to nudge that process along, and whether that's asking somebody internally to follow up or simply sending an email to the vendor to nudge them along. So the other example that we gave earlier, and we'll just touch on this very quickly, is the invoice suspended because they're not currently a vendor. And that's just another example of how we can check the various statuses of the vendors for which we're receiving invoices through AP. In this case, maybe that vendor is in the process of being approved, and somehow or another, this invoice got sent through ahead of time. They sort of jumped the gun. So that's fine. We can slide that over. We can check the status. We can follow up when they've filled out all their forms. That same escalation process we'll check, make sure that all the forms are there. When they are, then it'll allow that invoice to be released to the rest of the workflow, processed and paid. And so, again, a variety of different scenarios, different options, but always the same controlled and organized result. So finally, we'll talk a little bit about how can we make these e-forms available both to internal and to external individuals so that we can leverage e-forms. We've talked a lot about e-forms here because e-forms are a really wonderful way to automate the process and make the process of filling out the forms really easy and convenient. And so, for example, there are 3 that I'm going to share with you now. The first one is to direct an individual, again, whether it's internal or external person, to our web's portal, our web forms portal. So in this case, I'm taking them directly to the AP vendors portal. So these are forms that are available to any and all AP vendors, at least in the way that we're organizing it for today's demo. And so once they go out, they'll be able to address any one of these forms or any forms that are contained in this AP vendors portal. We can set up a number of different portals and portal locations. So I might have different or additional forms internal for our employees versus external for our vendors. A second is, as you saw earlier, or no, we didn't show it to you yet, is the actual forms module from within FileBound. So if I'm logged in as a user in FileBound, on my left-hand side, you'll see that there's a little forms icon. If I click that forms icon, that'll allow me to select the category. In this case, I select AP vendors, and then the form, which is the new vendor request form. So if I'm an employee looking to request for a new vendor, I can push that out right from my login to FileBound. And then the third and final is, as you've seen earlier, the link included in the emails. So we can send a link, and this link will take them directly to the form rather than to a list of forms within the portal. And so in this case, when they click on that, the new vendor request form opens up. They can fill it out and hit submit and begin that process of onboarding in this example. So again, we try to make it very easy, fast, and efficient to get to the documents, fill them out, and process the onboarding of your vendors. So with that, I'm going to open up to any additional questions that might have come in over time. And Jack, I'll let you take over, and we'll be able to answer those as much as we can.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, we got a couple of questions that came in. JD, you had talked about checking for required documents, and a question came in. It says, how does the system track that all the required documents have been submitted? JD, you might be muted.
So I am. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
All right. So yeah, at that point in time in the workflow, there are basically certain workflow stencils that we can use. We can also use PowerShell scripting to check for the presence of documents in certain dividers. The dividers are sort of key in that regard. And so when these documents or when these forms are submitted, the system automatically puts them in those dividers. So if they haven't been placed there, then the workflow will check and see that they're not in there. So it's kind of a combination of using dividers and either PowerShell or the stencils in the workflow to check for that.
Perfect, thanks. Here's another. Can the system create additional forms to send to the vendor based off the information they provided in the vendor information form?
I can take that, Jack. Yeah, the answer is yes, it can. What we do within the e-forms is we make the data available to us. So once it's submitted, that data, both on the index side and on the e-form side, is available to us. From there, we can grab that data and we can initiate or generate another unique e-form and drop that data in those e-forms. And so we can have one e-form, when it's submitted, feed a number of additional e-forms. And we can do that through the workflow as an individual form or as a forms process to generate them. So yes.
And here's kind of an extension of that too. It says, can the data from the vendor information form, such as banking information, be shared with my accounting software?
Yes, it can. Now, depending on what the APIs provide us as access will determine the degree to which we can make that an automated, seamless process. But yes, we can do that by exchanging the data between our system and your ERP.
Thanks, Bill. This one says we use DocuSign to apply e-signatures to other documents in our company. Can the vendor information form be signed electronically with DocuSign?
Yeah, we can use DocuSign to do those signatures. There is options too, like in our demo, for instance, we use just sort of basic signature options. There's a signature box and hand keying that in. But yes, there is a DocuSign and HelloSign integration with FileBound, so we can leverage that for this.
Thanks, JD. Here's the last question I've got, and we're right at the bottom of the hour, so this is perfect. Today we have vendors email supporting documents to us. Can we have the vendor attach additional documents to the vendor information form, and will they be saved to FileBound?
Yeah, there is an option to attach supporting documents or specific documents and sort them into dividers on that form or any form that we create for that matter. So yes, they can attach those documents and they would be placed into the right dividers in the vendor file.
Perfect, thank you. Just one final thing. Get back to our screen here. I just want to let you know that many of you that are on this call today with us have been in other webinars with us. And I want to let you know that we do have a YouTube channel that you can search the Priton group, and it'll bring up the screen that you see here. And it has all the different recordings from all the different sessions that we've had in the past. So if you want to go back and share one of these or rewatch one of these, they're available for you. So with that, I want to thank everyone for attending. We appreciate your time today. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to get a hold of any of us, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.